Hello everybody, Toreno here, and welcome to this next episode of my series looking at interwar tanks that I think should be added to War Thunder. And today we will be taking a look at Swedish tanks of the interwar period. So just a quick recap of Sweden's situation after World War I. Sweden had remained neutral in that war, so hadn't built any tanks domestically as a result. Instead, after the war they imported one French Renault FT light tank for testing, and 10 German LK2s. However, Sweden was in a bit of a unique situation, as after World War I, Germany, which was banned from owning tanks by the Treaty of Versailles, started to use Swedish companies as a way to bypass these restrictions. For example, Germany's Gutenhoffnungschutter, I probably mispronounced that, so we're just going to call it GHH from now on, which was also the owner of the future Panther tank developer Menne AG, bought 62.8% of the shares in the Swedish Landsverk company, while Krupp was the largest shareholder of Bofors, of course that being the company that would go on to develop the famous Bofors 40mm gun of World War II fame. This allowed Germany to start developing tanks in Sweden, and as a side effect propelled Sweden from a nation that initially had very little experience with tanks into a major exporter of tanks in the interwar period and beyond. So initially, when looking on how to build up its own tank force, Sweden, like many other nations, had a choice to make, namely should they buy the tanks from abroad or develop its tank force domestically, and initially they did look at buying tanks from other nations, for example the Renault NC27, a tank that I've covered before in the episodes looking at French and Japanese interwar tanks, and this tank was essentially supposed to be an upgrade to the Renault FT tank. As such, it does have some similarities to the Renault FT, being armed with the same short 37mm gun and manned by 2 crew. But it now has a 60 horsepower engine, enabling speeds of up to 12.4 miles per hour or 20 kilometers an hour, as well as a maximum armour thickness of 34mm. So this is now faster and better protected than the original FT tank. However, the short 37mm gun is still a pretty bad anti-tank weapon, only being capable of penetrating 15mm of armour at 100 metres. So I can't see this being added at much more than battle rating 0.7, but with its improved armour and speed, it would still be a welcome addition to the Swedish tech tree. In real life, the Swedes weren't particularly impressed by this tank, with it breaking down on numerous occasions. So no more tanks of this type were ordered, though the one example they did have was retained for experiments and driver training, and actually survives to this day. Sweden did import a few more vehicles, namely a single example each of the Carden Loyd Mark 5 and 6 tankettes, but these were only armed with machine guns and more intended for use as tractors for anti-tank guns rather than true tanks, while the more numerous Strv M37, a Swedish-built version of the Czech AHIV tankette, also only had machine guns. So not finding any other foreign tanks worth looking at, Sweden instead started to look at building tanks domestically, with the requirements being set out in December 1928, namely that it should be armed with a cannon and machine gun, have armour capable of stopping 37mm shells, be capable of an average speed of 20 km an hour on road and 10 km an hour off-road, and should weigh no more than 12 tonnes. At this time, only 2 Swedish companies really had designs ready to go at short notice, these being Bofors and Landsverk, which, to quote from Tank Encyclopedia, relied on German companies for design work. These companies were Krupp AG and Maschinenfabrik Esslinger, respectively. Maschinenfabrik Esslinger was, like Landsverk, a subsidiary of GHH, again showing the connections. And indeed, Bofors' offered design was literally just the German Krupp light tractor, which also used a Landsverk turret, again despite them in theory being a competitor. The ostensible Landsverk design, on the other hand, was the Raider Raupen Kampfwagen M28, a rather interesting design that could run on wheels or tracks, with all or most of the 6 tanks built in Germany by Maschinenfabrik Esslinger. I have seen some sources saying that 2 were built in Sweden by Landsverk, but I'm not able to confirm these, with one of these tanks being tested by Germany in the Soviet Union, though it was never adopted for German service. Swedish representatives soon learnt about the M28, which was designated the Landsverk L5 in Sweden, and they were able to view and test the tank, albeit without the hull or turret, where they were generally happy with the design, though its 15mm of armour was considered too thin. At this point, Landsverk offered 2 variants that were improved from the L5 design, one with the wheels cum track design and one fully tracked, which would eventually evolve into the Landsverk L30 and L10 designs respectively. In the end, Sweden ordered 3 of the more traditional L10s, but also ordered one L30, just to compare the wheel and track system with the more traditional track-only tanks in testing, though the L30 would be made of mild steel and fitted only with a dummy turret. So the fully tracked L10 design is already in War Thunder as the Strv M37, but we could still get the wheel and track L30 design, which was designated the FM31, and in many ways it is almost the same as the L10, with the big difference being the ability to switch between tracks and wheels, with the changeover taking just 30 seconds, and allowing a top speed of 21 miles per hour or 35 kilometers an hour on tracks, or 46 miles per hour or 75 kilometers an hour on wheels, which allows the tank to quickly move about on roads at high speed, before transitioning to tracks for going cross-country. However, the tracked mode is still slower than the L10's top speed of 43 kilometers an hour in-game, which can be explained by the larger weight, at 11.5 tonnes compared to the L10's 11 tonnes. And despite the extra weight, the armour only maxes out at 14mm compared to the L10's 24mm. The crew also stays the same at 4, though one of these was supposed to be a rear driver, which might lead to only one crew member being in the turret, which might potentially be a weakness if it affects the reload rate. Lastly, the armament is the same as the L10, with the same 37mm gun in the turret and 2 6.5mm machine guns, one in a coaxial position and one in the bow. In game I could see this being a 0.7 or 1.0 tank just before the M31, with the lower battle rating being possible due to the worse armour, and it should be added without the sabot shell that other Swedish tanks have. And overall I could see this being a fun little tank, scooting around the battlefield at high speeds on wheeled mode, but being vulnerable if subjected to return fire. Ultimately, the L30 was tested alongside the more conventional L10s, and while it was capable of a good top speed on wheels, the need for such a tank just wasn't there, with the wheeled mode needlessly making the tank far more complicated and expensive as a result. Though the test tank was retained and still exists to this day, along with one of the L10s, which also weren't ordered beyond the 3 existing examples. Unfortunately, while Sweden did make many more interwar tanks like the L60, L100 and L120, and indeed exported many of these tanks in large numbers, these have either already been added to the game or are only armed with machine guns, which would make these unsuitable for adding to War Thunder. However, there were quite a few armoured cars designed by Sweden during this period, which we can take a quick look at, such as the Pansarbil FM 26, the third of 3 armoured cars that were created in an attempt at producing a domestically built Swedish armoured car. And unlike the other 2, its turret could be armed with the 37mm gun from the Renault FT tank, though it seems this wasn't always installed and was essentially borrowed for testing on this armoured car, with a 6.5mm machine gun used the rest of the time. Unfortunately, the armour only maxes out at 5mm, and it seems this was not made of armour plate, though it was intended to heat treat the armour when used, but it's unclear if this was ever done. But either way, it would still be very vulnerable to enemy fire. Meanwhile, the top speed is about 37 miles per hour or 60 kilometers an hour, and unfortunately I haven't seen an exact crew count, though based on this picture it seemed to be at least 4, maybe 5 at a push. In game I couldn't see this being added above 0.3, mainly on account of the 37mm gun, but it could make for a good scouting vehicle in the lower battle ratings, and might be useful against less armoured targets. This and the 2 previously constructed armoured cars were used for some years, but unfortunately these didn't survive to the modern day. But the next vehicle, the Pansarbil FM 29 or L170, does still survive, and I have to say it is a rather odd looking armoured car, and although riveted, the armour is decently sloped in places to maximise protection, though only maxing out at 6mm and again possibly not being made of armour plate, which would be a bit of a problem. The armament is also somewhat odd, as the 37mm 1898 naval gun is mounted in the hull, limiting its usefulness in battle, while a 6.5mm machine gun is mounted in the turret, along with one in the hull. However, it does have a top speed of 37 miles per hour or 60 kilometers an hour in both directions, as there is a driver situated at the rear of the vehicle, which might allow for quicker turning, mitigating the poor armament placement a little bit. Talking of crew, 4 to 5 crew are carried, allowing for some losses to be taken during combat situations without this causing too many issues. In-game, I could see this being a 0.3 vehicle, maybe 0.7 depending on how powerful the 37mm naval gun is, but it would be somewhat vulnerable to return fire, and less able to fight back due to its main armament's poor placement. In real life, only the one prototype was made, mainly due to the high cost of this vehicle, though it remained in service until 1946, and as mentioned, it still exists to this day. Of course, the armoured car most people know Sweden for is the Landsverk L180, a vehicle that was exported all over Europe and saw service with many nations during World War II, such as the Netherlands and Denmark. But it was not actually supposed to be in service with Sweden, who never actually bought any. However, Ireland, who already had 8 of them in service, had ordered 5 more examples in 1939, but due to the outbreak of war, was unable to receive them. So Sweden took possession of them and put them into service as the Pansarbil M41, and refunded Ireland after the war. In Swedish service, some changes were made, for example replacing the 20mm Madsen cannon with the 20mm M40, which has an in-game penetration of 30mm at 500 metres or 40mm at 100 metres. A decent performance for an autocannon, while a machine gun in a coaxial position and another in the bow rounded out the armament. Of course, being an armoured car, its armour isn't the best, only maxing out at 15mm, but this is enough for against small arms fire, while larger caliber weapons should be avoided using its superior speed, which maxes out at around 46 mph or 75 km/h. It's also helped by the fact a rear driver is carried amongst the 5-man crew, allowing the L180 to escape ambushes even if the main driver is knocked out. In War Thunder, I would suggest adding the L180 at 1.3 to 1.7, as it has a decent armament, large crew to offset any crew losses, and a good enough speed to get around the map, do recon, cap points, and flank enemies when needed. And it would be nice for the nation that invented and exported the L180 to so many different countries to have this vehicle in its tech tree. Lastly, we come to the Pansarbil M37, a lower cost armoured car that, while more vulnerable due to the open top fighting compartment, still packs a punch, with the initial variant being armed with 2 8mm machine guns, one fired from the driver's cab and one in the truck bed, so useful for against aircraft, while later this was replaced by a 37mm naval gun, giving a fighting chance against tanks, and replaced again in 1942 by a 20mm autocannon. Of course, it is rather vulnerable, with thin armour and an open-topped fighting compartment, so most enemies could easily deal with it, while its top speed is around 47 mph or 60 km/h, and a crew of about 5 to 6 seems to have been carried. I could see the M31 with 2 machine guns being placed at 0.7 to 1.0 as an early SPAA vehicle, while the cannon-armed variants could work at 1.3 to 1.7. Being somewhat vulnerable but still useful for scouting and surprising enemies in ambushes, and it would be nice for this lesser known Swedish vehicle to be included in War Thunder. So that's it for this episode looking at Swedish interwar tanks I would like to see added to War Thunder, and I'd be interested to see your views on these vehicles and any other tanks you'd like me to cover in the comments below. So next week we'll probably cover China just to finish off all of the main tech trees in War Thunder, and then we'll definitely be doing Spain and probably Czechoslovakia to finish off the series, so hopefully you'll be looking forward to those episodes. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed today's episode. I've been Toreno, and I'll see you next time.